Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Welcome to episode 135 of the Monday Night Review. I've been plagued today by microphone troubles. I'm a little bit frustrated. I've got one hand painted nails, the other hand I thought I'd be able to finish whilst we were chatting, but no. My microphone seems to have died. My husband bought himself a microphone for podcasting that is not ideal. Maybe I'm using it wrong. And so now I'm using one of those lapel mics that are all the rage with Instagram and TikTokers. And I did buy it I had a very specific thing in mind, which has now left me. I don't know what it is. I think it's doing voiceovers on my makeup stuff. I have a very niche and specific hatred. Some people don't like the sound of nails down a blackboard. My husband cannot bear the squeaky noise of polystyrene. I'm fine with all of these. Cannot bear the feeling of sponge, foam, and there is a foamy top to these microphones. So I'm saying this through really tickly, gritted teeth. This is how this story is going to go, and it's going to be a long one. Make a brew, buckle up. We're going back to 1907, the Greater Manchester area. It's a classic. This one has actually been requested by a couple of people, most recently by Eve. But if this is something that you have requested, maybe it's time to get together and start some sort of crime-solving syndicate, because you're not alone. There are many of you that want to solve this. I was hoping it's 6:30. Usually I like to have podcasts uploaded by 6:30 on a Monday night. I'm just sitting down to record this. God knows what time you're going to get it. Really, really, really want my pizza that I'm due to have. So let's get cracking. We're going back, as I said, to 1907, to Stalybridge. And we're going to be talking about George Harry Storrs. Now, George Harry is called George Harry. Harry is not his middle name. Of course, now I've got a helicopter. It's a bank holiday Monday. Why wouldn't there be a low-flying helicopter over my conservatory? So, yes, George Harry is his name, not George Storrs. He is called George Harry, and he is the son of William Storrs, whose parents had moved into the area when he was 3. So William trained as a carpenter. Then he was a master builder. He became a mill owner, a benefactor, and counsellor. He basically worked hard and did good. George was born in 1861. He's the middle child, and is so often the case. He's the middle median of his 2 brothers. His younger brother, William, was his parents' favourite. It was the apple of their eye. Never did a day's work in his life. He drank too much, partied too much. And weirdly, when his parents died, he inherited the family home, not his older brothers. But he didn't live there for long. He died of drink at the age of 37. James, on the other hand, the eldest, was pompous. He had a huge family. James was unmarried. William was unmarried. James was married and had a lot of children. I think his first wife died, and he went on to remarry and have more children. And he was ruled tyrannically by all means. He was sort of pompous and bossy and talked a lot of talk, but actually it was George Harry who knew the business. James inherited a third of the family business, which would become half when William died, but he didn't take any time to learn it. George Harry, on the other hand, left school at 13, joined the family firm, and learnt every aspect. By the time he was in his 40s, he was running it basically single-handedly and diversified it to include cotton spinning, building contracting, painting, plumbing, trade in construction materials, sawing of timber for both businesses and individuals, and the manufacture of bricks and tiles. His sole interest was his business. So he was married, as we will hear, but his sole interest was his business, and he was good at it. He made a success of it. He was, I suppose, his father's son. He was known to be careful with money. Some would say he was a miser. And he married at the relatively late age of 31. He lived with his parents until he was married. And I suppose people thought perhaps he wasn't going to get married. More on that later. But then Mary Margaret Middleton, a spinster, I'm using bunny ears to say that because obviously now if you're in your 30s and you're not married, that nobody bats an eyelash. But a spinster, she lived with her father near Morecambe, which is sort of near-ish. And she came to Stalybridge to see her sister, who was married to a leather courier in town. And at some point, Maggie, as she liked to be called, was introduced to George Harry Storrs. He's 2 years her junior, so she probably really was considered, if she was 33, 34, she really probably was considered a spinster, well over the hill. And they struck up a friendship and a relationship. And on the 11th of August, 1891, they were married. Now, William Storrs, the father, bought them Gorse Hall as a wedding present. Gorse Hall is quite a bizarre building. It had stood empty since 1884, and only certain rooms were redecorated and used, and the others were locked up. So George Harry is sort of a contradiction in this way. He lives and accepts the present of this huge house, but doesn't use all the rooms. Some of the rooms are locked up, which kind of, I mean, you're going to leave them to go to ruin, I guess, if you're not using them and not living in them. It sort of seems like a waste of money. So they're living in this huge house, and they have a few members of staff. They have a cook, a housekeeper, and a coachman who was more than a coachman. He was sort of George Harry's man Friday, as it were. He did lots of different things. And the coachman lived above the stables with his wife, Sarah. When Maggie's brother-in-law died, and then her sister a few years later, George Harry and Maggie took in their child, Marion, who was 9 at the time. And though they didn't have any children of their own, Marion would be seen as their sort of adopted child. They loved her. She lived with them happily, always. And Maggie and George Harry were not social, and not sociable. Marion would go on to be a lot more sociable than they were. They were not that sociable, but the main visitor to the house was a solicitor and contemporary of George Harry called Robert Innes, who handled a lot of the business and legal stuff for Storrs and had moved close to Gorse Hall. So George Harry seems to be quite, not reclusive, but not, he works hard. He's either at work or he's at home. He has a wife late in the day, which I think must have come as a bit of a surprise to some people. And he has 2 people that he's friends with, and one of them is Robert Innes. And in 1903, a new coachman, James Worrell, arrives, and he is employed along with his wife, Sarah, as I said, and he lives above the stables, and he develops this sort of dog-like devotion to Storrs, and they become more like friends than boss and coachman. And I've seen it said that it was an inappropriate relationship, but I don't think this means that it was a homosexual relationship. So this will be implied later, and we'll get into that. But obviously at the time, if you had servants, you treated them as such. And I believe that George Harry and James Worrell would go walking around the grounds together and chatted a lot. And so this was unusual for the time. So though he had lots of money, there's no electricity or gas at Gorse Hall. It's lit by oil lamps. There's no telephone line. Now, the telephone line to the town was fairly new anyway, but rather than being one of those rich men who had all the latest newfangled fads and things, George Harry was very much the opposite. There's no electricity, no gas, and no telephone line. But opposite the house is this sort of community hall, and there is a telephone line in there. So in an emergency, that is where the nearest phone is. And, that this is how they live. Relatively old school, even for the time. So they're happy there. Marion's, as far as we know, very happy there, very happy with her aunt and uncle. She is more outgoing than them, but there's no restriction of what she should be doing. They literally just seem like not generally very sociable people, rather than people who don't like other people or who are puritanical about socializing or anything like that. Now, just before 10 o'clock on Friday the 10th of September 1909, James Worrell, the coachman, arrives panting and sweating at the police station. He's run all the way from Gorse Hall, and he says there's been a shooting. Now, everyone knows Gorse Hall. Everyone knows George Harry Storrs. He is the sort of benefactor of the town. He owns a lot. He employs a lot of people. So a sergeant and 4 constables are sent out immediately on foot. The only form of transport for the police station at the time was bicycle, and you obviously can't get 5 people on that. So they all set out on foot to Gorse Hall. And when they arrive, Eliza Cooper, who's the housemaid, lets them in, and they're introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Storrs. And they actually have a visitor with them at the time, Georgina MacDonald, who is a friend of Maggie's, who's recently been widowed and has come down to stay. Now, Marion, who's a teenager at the time, is away on a visit. So there's no Marion in the house, but there is Georgina MacDonald. And what they tell the police is that at about 9:30 that night, George Harry is reading in an armchair by the fire, waiting for supper to be served. And he sees a shadowy figure outside the window. He goes over to investigate and hears the voice say, "Hands up or I'll shoot." A pane of glass is broken and the barrel of a gun pushed through. George Harry Storrs pulls down the blind of the window. 2 shots are fired. And at some point, Maggie comes in and she grabs him to stop him going out. I actually believe that Maggie and Georgina are in the same room. They're at the table chatting or playing cards, waiting for supper. And Maggie stops George Harry from rushing outside to see who this person is with a gun. Eliza, the housemaid, comes in, having heard the noise, and Storrs tells her to summon James Worrell from his apartment above the stables. He himself is unable to give a description of the man to the police, pointing out that it's light in the room and dark outside, and therefore you can't see very well. Now, 3 policemen from the village of Duckenfield then join, because the grounds for Gorse Hall are mostly in the Duckenfield area, which means that it's technically in their jurisdiction. So they arrive and they search the grounds and they find nothing, no trespasser. They search the room and they find no bullets, no bullet holes, no shell casings. There's no hole in the blind either. That the window is broken. But the police come to the conclusion that if shots had been fired, they were either blanks or they'd been fired outside by a drunk person with a terrible aim, and they hadn't actually been fired into the room. The police interview Storrs, and they obviously say, "Do you have anyone who bears a grudge to you or anything like that?" And he says no. He says that there's a tenant in one of his cottages who has racing pigeons that he didn't like, and he said to them that you either have to get rid of the racing pigeons or move out. But it seems a bit extreme to sort of come and shoot through the window and also risk being recognised and then turned into the police. When asked if he'd fired anyone with anything to do with firearms, he gave them one name, though he said he didn't believe the man was the culprit, and this man was later interviewed by the police and cleared. So this is all very strange. It's kind of vague. The housekeeper said she heard a noise and came rushing in. Storrs suggested to the police that he puts a bell up in a tower in Gorse Hall and that this is a sort of emergency alarm. And if something happens, then that someone can ring the bell and the police in town will hear and the alarm will be raised. I believe the police station is about a quarter of a mile away. He also requested that a man be put on guard outside the house. And this is what happens. A church-sized bell is erected the next Monday. And the grounds of Gorse Hall are added to the policeman's beat. So there's this sort of meeting place, I believe it's an Oddfellows Hall, opposite the entrance to Gorse Hall. And that is part of the policeman's beat. So I think they just make it so they take in the hall on the way round. Now, at midnight on Friday the 29th of October, the village of Stalybridge is woken up by the sound of the bell ringing, which must have been super eerie. Two policemen who were patrolling the grounds went to see what was going on, and a sergeant and a constable from the station at Stalybridge set off. Now, when the first two policemen arrive, they find George Harry standing on the doorstep with the front door open and his pocket watch in hand. And he sees them arrive and he calls out to whoever's behind him ringing the bell and tells them to stop. And he tells the policeman he's been testing the bell out to see if it worked. And I think everyone was a little bit ticked off about this because obviously they came running, everyone was woken up. It's quite loud, it's a church bell, middle of the night. And so everyone's a bit not happy. Boy who cried wolf situation. And the policemen don't fail to mention, neglect to mention, whatever you'd have it, as that in 3 days' time, on the evening of the 1st of November, there would be no one on patrol as they needed all the police to keep the peace in the neighbouring towns on election day. There was going to be no one being voted for in Stalybridge, so those police had been asked to go elsewhere. It also seemed to them that having been watching the house for the past 7 weeks, patrolling the grounds at night, nothing had happened, no one had been there. It would seem that one night off wasn't much of a problem. At 5 o'clock on the 1st of November, George Harry Storrs started the walk home from the Aqueduct Mill, which was his mill, and this walk would take about half an hour. Now, this would be dark. 5 o'clock, Manchester area, 1st of November, he's walking in the dark. And this is how he normally did it. He always walked to and from. He gets home as normal. The next thing we know is at 9:15, he's playing patience cards while waiting for supper. Perfectly normal. We don't know what he did really in between 5:30, 6 o'clock when he got home and 9 o'clock, but nothing unusual. Maggie and Marion are sitting at the table that had been laid, and Eliza, the housemaid, was walking back towards the kitchen, as was the cook, Mary Evans, who'd been just getting something from the cellar. So Mary Evans is the cook, Eliza is the housemaid, and they're both heading back towards the kitchen. Mary enters the kitchen first, and she sees a man standing there who she initially thinks is Worrell, the coachman. Remember, everything's lit by oil lamps, and they are moving around the house with the help of oil lamps. So she actually says, "Oh, he gave me such a shock," and then realizes that he doesn't resemble Worrell at all. Tall and thin, where Worrell is short and, as I've put in my notes, festive. She realizes this isn't him. He's younger than Worrell, and he is pointing a gun at her head. Now, she backs up and runs into the hall, bumping into Eliza, and shouts, "There's a man in the house." She then tries to shut the kitchen door behind her, but the man is holding onto it, and she's not able to. And he yanks it open and chases the cook down the hall. She runs to the parlour where George, Harry, Maggie and Marion are already standing up. They've heard her shouting, and she repeats, "There's a man in the house." George Harry Storrs walks into the oil-lit hallway, followed by the three women, and it's here that he comes face to face with the intruder. The man is described as wearing a cap, muffler, which is a sort of scarf, a green tweed suit, and he says, quote, "Now I've got you." George Harry Storrs, who is 6 foot, he's not a small man, lunged at the revolver, and the two men struggle. And Maggie, because she's a badass, grabs a shillelagh from the wall, so big club from the wall, and runs over to hit the man with it. And he looks terrified. She actually doesn't strike him because she's worried that she might hit her husband. But this is enough. He stands up. He says, "I will not shoot. I will not shoot." And Maggie snatches the gun away from him. She hides the gun under a bit of carpet, and she gives the shillelagh to her husband and runs off to ring the bell. Marion sees her aunt running up the stairs and assumes she's running away. And so she too decides to run away, and she opens the front door and she flees outside. The cook, Mary Evans, is so ready to use the servants' entrance that she actually doubles back in the hallway and goes out through the servants' door via the kitchen. And she finds Eliza Cooper, the housekeeper, standing outside the kitchen door, and they go to the stables to get James Worrell. And Mrs. Worrell opens the door to their frantic knocking. They're incoherent, they're crying, and she tells them that her husband has gone to Stalybridge to do some shopping and then have a drink with his brother. So the other man in the house is not there. Meanwhile, Marion has made it over the road to the Oddfellows Hall opposite Gorse Hall and bursts in, managing to say, "My uncle is being murdered." Now, typically, everyone is outraged that a woman has set foot in there. So she's having to try and convince them that something's going on whilst they're being outraged. Meanwhile, two men who keep racing pigeons to the west of Gorse Hall, not the tenants with the racing pigeons he didn't like, are checking for any returning pigeons late at night, and they hear the bell at Gorse Hall start ringing. So they hear the bell start ringing. They climb over the wall into the grounds of Gorse Hall, and they see a man running down the drive. They're afraid of being caught trespassing, so they don't know what's gone on in the house. They don't know why the bell is ringing. And so they hide behind a tree to see what else they can see is going on. So meanwhile, poor Marion is trying to convince people to come and help her. And the first men from the Liberal Club over the road arrive, and they find the kitchen looking, quote, like an abattoir. George Harry Storrs has lost his fight with the intruder and was lying on the floor, stabbed 15 times. He was still alive and repeatedly asked for his wife. He was asked if he knew his attacker. He didn't respond. He didn't try and say who it was. He just wanted his wife. It's unclear whether... So upstairs, the bell finally stops ringing. Maggie Storrs is found upstairs, kneeling, holding onto the bell rope, which she'd been ringing for half an hour. Her hands had to be prized off the rope, and she was helped to her bedroom. She's exhausted. She's terrified. She's crying. She's sweating. She's in a right state, is what we'd say. Constable David Buckley is the first to arrive on the scene. He asks George Harry Storrs who is lying, and he said, "Who was this man?" And George Harry responds, "I don't know." James Worrell arrives home. He too has heard the bell ringing, and he's crying, saying he'd initially assumed the bell ringing was just a test run like the one from a few days before, so he hadn't sort of hurried back. One of the next policemen to arrive had some first aid training and was starting to try and help Storrs out, who was crying out for his wife, but it was fairly obvious that this was not going to end well. It's unclear whether Maggie didn't want to see her husband. Interestingly, I think it's Wikipedia, but there's one that makes it sound like she refused to see her husband. But I believe it's more likely that she was kept away because she was in such a state. And she does get to him, but by the time she gets to him, he's in and out of consciousness. And she keeps fainting. So she's then carried out. So depending on what you read, either she doesn't want to see him, which we will talk about later, or refuses to see him, or they don't really think it's going to be completely fatal, even though there's blood everywhere, and think it's inappropriate for a lady to see what they see, or she's just she's completely knacked and can't be seen and that kind of thing. So she keeps fainting. She's taken up to her room. The doctor arrives at about 10. So this all happens quite quickly because we know that at 9:15, he's playing patience waiting for his supper. And at 10 o'clock, this is happening. Just around 10, the first doctor arrives, by which time Storrs is gasping for air and the doctor realizes there's nothing that can be done. And in fact, George Harry Storrs dies from his wounds just after 10 o'clock. Superintendent Croghan is in charge of the case, and he arrives just after Storrs has died. He meets another doctor on the drive, and he and the doctor go into the house. There are loads of people there. Some members of the Liberal Club over the road, other policemen have arrived. The first doctor's there. All the members of staff are there. And he immediately orders some of the policemen outside to search the ground. And PC Buckley was sent to the railway station to see if there was anyone there waiting for a train, to interview the staff there, to see if anyone had been seen. Now, Stalybridge is a small station, but it was really well connected with trains to Huddersfield, Oldham and Manchester. And this meant that it was open 24 hours a day, though there is a break where there's no trains between 11:50 p.m. and 2:19 a.m. But at the time, this is a fairly amazing thing to have. So if you had bumped someone off, you could easily go straight to the station and get on a train. So it was worthwhile. Croghan sent men to both police stations to put an alert out for any suspicious-looking men, any men with blood on them, and he sends for Major Richardson, who has bloodhounds. He himself starts to look around the kitchen and the scullery, making a note of blood and other evidence. Now, a window in the scullery has been broken by having a tin wash basin thrown through it from the inside. The basin is dented and on the stones outside the scullery. So they know that that's how the window was broken. And it's thought that the men had fought their way down the hallway, and then Storrs somehow managed to lock his attacker in the scullery before falling to the floor. The attacker escaped by throwing the basin through the window and then returned to the attack through the open kitchen door. But the fact that there have been 12 to 15 people milling around means that it's going to be impossible to know where the blood was from the attack and what had been walked through or wiped round since. The two men who had the racing pigeons, who had heard the bell and climbed into the ground, they're called Matthew Greenwood and Thomas Cotterill, and they were found by the police searching the grounds. And they told their story, and when they were examined, they were found to have no blood on them. There's no reason why they would have attacked, and their story stands up. And Croghan is fairly sure they're not involved in the crime, but they're taken to Stalybridge police station for further questioning anyway, and they're able to say that they did see someone running down the drive. Meanwhile, the two doctors at the scene examine the body, which is so covered in blood, it's hard to count the number of wounds, though they believe there to be about 12, mostly on the left side to the chest and the back. Marion was still awake. She refused a sleeping draught from the doctor. She wanted to sit up with her aunt, who had fallen asleep, and they leave a phial of sleeping draught for the aunt just in case she woke up. So the doctors strip the body down. They fold up the clothes. Obviously, forensics is basically non-existent at this time, but the clothes are evidence, and the body is left covered on the kitchen floor. As the doctors leave, James Storrs, the older brother, arrives. We're not quite sure how he hears the news, most likely gossip of something happening at Gorse Hall. He's shocked, but noted to be not surprised, and he demands to see the body of his brother. And Krogan takes this moment to make sure that he checks his brother's clothing to prevent allegations of theft by policemen later down the line, which was a big thing at the time. It was first thought that, so they find the revolver. Maggie has hidden it under the carpet, and they find this. And it was first thought that actually it was a dummy. We know that George Harry was not shot; he was stabbed. And they later find that actually it's an American bulldog, not actually made in America, more likely to be found in Europe, made in Belgium, very rarely seen in Great Britain. And they take the gun away to be locked away at Duncanfield police station, and they have it looked at by an expert. And the trigger and the swivel pin connecting the hammer and the mainspring had been tampered with, making it threatening looking but unfireable. And this would be huge in court cases later on. It couldn't be fired. In fact, they found so much dust in the cylinder that it meant that it hadn't been in working order for a long time. So Mark Platt arrives at Gorse Hall the next day with two of his bloodhounds. They're still waiting for Major Richardson. His bloodhounds are called Faithful and Princess Louina. And they are taken to the kitchen. They then lead their owner and some policemen zigzagging across fields until they reach a quarry full of water. Platt tells reporters that he thinks the knife or the culprit will be found in this quarry. However, he returns the next days. The dog lead him to a different water-filled quarry, which meant many people actually believe that the dogs were just thirsty after running about. George Harry Storrs was a rich man and not only owned half of the family business, obviously, but he left around £22,316, which in today's money is £2,211,756, which is no small amount. So though he was mean with his money, so obviously a man in that position, they think, could he have lots of enemies? Was he mean? His workers said after he died that he was a jannock, which is a local word for a good boss, a fair boss. And so it seems that though he was tight with his money, he wasn't mean in person. Police questioned anyone who appeared to be in a fight or had been in a fight recently. For example, a man who went round the towns playing the concertina was noticed to have a livid cut down one side of his face, so he was taken in. Turn out that he had fallen off his bicycle and had witnesses to prove it. Several people in the area were known to have criminal records and were initially suspected, including a man named Mark Wilde, who we'll get to later. But there is always lack of evidence. Everyone seems to have an alibi. And Cheshire's Chief Constable, Colonel John Henry Hammersley, arrives to oversee the case. And this is a big deal. George Harry Storrs is a big deal, and this sort of thing just doesn't happen. He orders 3 quarries in the area and a lagoon to be dragged. They find nothing. Mrs. Storrs, Marion, and the servants of the house all give a description of the assailant, but it doesn't really narrow it down, but they all say the same thing, which is interesting. So he's 25 to 27 years of age, 5'6" to 5'8", thin features, very fair to pale complexion, slight moustache, which may, of course, have been shaved off. And it's worth noting that the average height for a man at the time was 5'6". I believe the average height for a man now is 6 foot. Could be wrong. But I think now if you said, oh, someone broke into my house and he's 5'6", it's actually, that does narrow it down quite a bit. Whereas at the time, that is very much the average height of men. So he's very average. And all witnesses except Mrs. Storrs said there was something, quote, peculiar about his eyes, which is obviously one of the things you hear of a lot about people who have done this sort of thing. Oh, he looked wrong, or he looked weird. So a description and a drawing of the gun was sent to all police forces in the county and then sent to newspapers to be printed, and was eventually printed and hung up in pubs because it was such an unusual gun that they were hoping that somebody would recognize it as belonging to someone. Now, only one man came forward, a stage manager from Oldham, who had said that someone had recently tried to sell him a similar gun to use as a prop. But when shown the gun, he couldn't be 100% sure. And that uncertainty dogs this case throughout because people can never be 100% sure. And it really brings to light, like, unless you kept a diary, then you would be vague about stuff. We've got phones, we've got computers, everything now has dates and times on it, but everyone here is so vague. So after the funeral, it's decided that George Harry's eldest son, William, would run the business, having been his father's right-hand man for years. James and Maggie had a heated argument about whether Maggie should sell her shares in the business, which she had inherited from her husband. James thought he should sell them to her. She said absolutely not. Sensible woman. Maggie promised James Worrell a job as long as he wanted one, and she wanted to move out of Gorse Hall as soon as possible. She did not want to be there. And James, or the company, the family company, was offering a £100 reward for any information on the murder, which was a large sum of money at the time. It's a third of the weekly payroll. And Maggie upped it to £500, which is £51,000 in today's money. That is a lot. On Friday the 12th of November, James Worrell was due to be fitted for a new uniform. Now, this had been organised by George Harry when he was alive. He'd been very depressed since George Harry's death, bursting into tears a lot. He was subdued. He wasn't properly sleeping. His wife was really worried about him. And on this Friday, he went to the shops to get some things. He did his usual duties with the horses. But when he hadn't returned home by 5:30, Sarah sent one of her sons to fetch her brother from the town to help her look for him. And there was a policeman stationed outside the stables. So she said she hadn't seen her husband. She was worried about him. And they went to look in various stables and outbuildings, and they found nothing. There was no evidence of him at all. So they then notify the police station that the coachman is missing, and they go and look in all his favourite pubs. No avail, that there's nothing. Detective Sergeant Albert Lee knew Worrell. He is a local man, I believe. His brother's in the town at least. So Albert Lee knows Worrell and had been worried about him. He'd seen him on and off and knew that he had taken his master's death very badly. Despite the stables having already been searched, he went to have a look anyway, and he found Worrell's canvas bag at the foot of a ladder into the hayloft. He went up the ladder and found Worrell hanging from a beam. Lee believed he'd been dead for at least 6 hours, and though he left no note, it was quite clear that he had done this himself. The police are really trying. They don't have a lot of evidence, but they're really trying to find who's responsible. And the first person they set their sights on is a man called Cornelius Howard, who's a relative of the Storrs, very distant. I think he's a cousin, who had been arrested for various things including burglary. Basically, burglary was his thing. He was known to have been staying in Stalybridge at the time. He was eventually arrested and found to have blood on his clothing and on his body when he was made to undress. And they found several lacerated wounds on his legs. And he said initially that he got these wounds when his landlord had dropped a pane of glass that had shattered and cut his legs. They could very well be from climbing through a broken window in the scullery. Now, Howard would change this story and said that actually he'd got these cuts from breaking in to burgle somewhere. Mrs. Storrs, Marion, and the servants had been to 2 identity parades and had not picked anyone out. And then it's time for Howard to be in an identity lineup. And Marion Linley immediately identifies him. The cook is less definite. She did eventually say that Howard looked like the man she'd seen, but she couldn't be sure. Eliza Cooper, the housemaid, also pointed out Howard immediately, and he said he looked like the man. And Cornelius Howard is then charged with the murder of George Harry Storrs. Now, I don't believe that even Maggie had met Cornelius Howard before, so it wasn't like he was a cousin who was regularly at the house. It's very much worth noting that George Harry is asked by the doctor and by the policeman whether he knows who has done this, and he says no. Interestingly, one of the barristers who would go on to represent Howard was Edward Theophilus Nelson, one of the first, if not the first West Indian to wear a stuff gown in the English courts. At Howard's trials, Mrs. Storrs broke down, was sort of completely inconsolable, and was then very vague about the identification, saying it could be him. She said, quote, "I think he is the man. He knows," which is sort of a random thing to say. Howard has changed his story about how he got the cuts on his legs, which obviously doesn't look good. They also find a barber who said that Howard had asked him for a clean shave the morning after the murder, thus removing a light moustache. All witnesses said that Howard looked like the man, but the man had had a moustache. So they come up with an idea that they are going to deny him access to shaving equipment whilst he's in prison to see what he looks like with a moustache. And after a couple of weeks, he has a fully flourishing beard, but his moustache remains fuzzy, so they give up on that. Various witnesses were called, including the landlord of a pub in Huddersfield where Howard said he'd been the night of the murder. And again, they're also vague on the date. So Cornelius Howard says he's been in this pub. He plays the landlord at dominoes in exchange for beer. If he wins the dominoes, he gets beer. And the landlord said, yep, that did happen, but I can't be sure if it's that date or if it's another date. And there are sailors in there, and the sailors say, yep, we saw him playing dominoes, but we cannot be sure what date it was. And on Wednesday, the 24th of November, the jury returns the verdict of willful murder against Cornelius Howard, and he is taken to Strangeways Prison for 3 months before he'd go to Chester Castle to stand trial for the murder at the assizes. So on Thursday, the 3rd of March, Mr. Justice Pickford is the judge, and here Cornelius stands trial for murder. By this time, Eliza Cooper has no doubt in her mind that Howard was the man she'd seen in the house that night. And Marion Linley also said she's positive that Howard was the man guilty of murdering her uncle. But many witnesses come forward saying they did see Howard in the pub playing dominoes with the landlord, again, unsure of the exact date. And some actually say they particularly noticed him because they thought he was a detective. Gaming was illegal in Huddersfield pubs, and so they thought that Cornelius Howard was trying to trap the landlord by saying, do you want to play dominoes? And then he'd be able to say, you're not supposed to be doing this, and fine him. The prosecution tried to push Howard on why he'd lied when initially questioned by the police about the cuts on his leg, and he said he didn't want to admit that he was breaking and entering. And they said, well, surely murder is a worse charge. And he was like, well, I had no concept that I would be, he wasn't properly cautioned. So he had no concept that he would be potentially charged with murder, and he didn't want to be charged with breaking and entering. There was a lot of hoo-ha about why he wasn't close with his cousin, George Harry. And he was and they said, so were you his enemy? And he was like, no, we just, when we saw each other, we were nice. We just didn't see each other. And this seemed to be a big thing for the prosecution. But, Cornelius Howard wasn't a great person, and George Harry was not hugely sociable and a well-regarded businessman. I have cousins that I don't see very often, So they made this huge thing of it. But Cornelius Howard kept his cool and was just like, it wasn't that we had a falling out. It wasn't that we didn't like each other. We just didn't see each other. So no, I haven't been to his house and I haven't seen his family. Blah, blah, blah. And eventually the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Now, in 1910, Maggie Storrs moves to a village just across from Morecambe Bay. She said she hated Gorse Hall. She took what she wanted. She told the people of Stalybridge to take what they wanted. The place was ransacked within a day. Even the brass knobs were taken off the door handles. And then eventually Gorse Hall would be torn down. It seems that everything's gone cold, but an attack on a courting couple in June 1910 seemed to have many similarities to the attack at Gorse Hall. There's a man of a similar description wielding a sharp knife. He'd gone in, he'd threatened to cut the couple's heads off. The man had been stabbed in a few places, but had fought with the assailant, and his girlfriend had managed to go and get help. And the people who came to help were able to identify the attacker, and the attacker was a man called Mark Wilde. He seemed to remember the night of the murder at Gorse Hall very well, almost too well. It was very convenient that evening he had decided to skip work and got into a fight, covering him in blood. He admitted to owning 2 revolvers, which he had disposed of, worried that they would incriminate him should people come and look at them, because one was very similar to an American bulldog. He said one was not in working order. He showed policemen where he'd thrown them, saying that he'd done it sometime in February, and the police didn't find anything to do with the guns. So whereas Cornelius Howard was sort of incredibly vague about where he'd been, it seems that Mark Wilde was almost too sure. And they search his house, they find ammunition that matched the ammunition found in the American bulldog, but would have also worked in the guns that he had, that his family said he had. Now, he's also arrested. He's committed to trial at the Chester Assizes for the attack on the couple, and he's held in Knutsford Jail. Now, his pre-trial starts on the 12th of July, where he has initially no legal representation. He's eventually granted some. He's found guilty of this attack, where he's threatened to cut their heads off, stabbed someone. He's just given 2 months hard labour, which seems particularly lenient. But police have their eye on him for the murder of George Harry Storrs at Gorse Hall, and they do a lineup. So he's taken out of prison and he's put in a lineup, and the cook and the housekeeper identify him. Marion Linley said he very much resembled the man who had attacked her uncle. And so he is taken back to the assizes in October. He's represented by Edward Nelson. And Edward Nelson really focuses on the fact that all the witnesses were positive that Cornelius Howard was the man. So could they really be positive that Mark Wilde was actually the man? He had a noticeable mole under his right eye and a scar under his left, where he'd had an abscess lanced when he came out of the army. And none of the witnesses had mentioned this. You know, they'd said he had the attacker had a slight moustache, he had a pale complexion and all of this. Nobody had mentioned the mole, which was obviously very noticeable, and nobody had mentioned the scar. There's a whole load of toing and froing about the guns that Wilde had disposed of. Both his mother and 2 of his sisters said the American bulldog was similar, but missing specific bits. And eventually the jury finds him not guilty. Jonathan Goodman, who writes the book The Stabbing of George Harry Storrs, has his own theory about what happened. But there are 2 quite believable theories. One theory is that George Harry Storrs, perhaps with James Worrell, was engaging in a homosexual relationship, which would explain why, for many, he seemed indifferent to his wife. there again are differing accounts of whether he's indifferent to his wife or whether he actually is very attached to his wife. And he was having an affair with James Worrell, and this would explain why Worrell was so distressed and completed suicide after his death. And this would also open him up to blackmail, and perhaps he had refused, he was worried about this and had put James Worrell up to poking a gun through the window so that he had an excuse to put the bell up because he was worried for his safety. He'd been threatened. He knew something was going to happen. Goodman suggests that in 1897, Robert Innes, the solicitor friend, and his wife Emma engaged a 23-year-old governess for their elder daughter. The governess was named Maria Hall. She was blonde-haired, Swiss, and, quote, admirable in every way. She was clever, she was intelligent, she was good-looking. She was the whole package, baby. George Harry Storrs talked very basic German with her, and by 1905 they were sometimes seen walking in the park together. Then, in 1908, Maria Hall went to Oxford, supposedly to get a qualification in English language and literature, but weirdly came back without having sat the exam. She was slightly plumper than she had been before and deeply depressed. And Emma Innes was very worried about her, and along with being depressed, Maria would now often say that she was unworthy. She was unworthy, she was bad. She stopped taking communion in church. She came from a very religious family. She said she was too unworthy to take communion in church. In the first week of February 1909, Maria Hall put a note through Emma Innes's door saying, quote, do not expect me back tonight. Nobody is to blame, only myself. It is heartrending to leave you all. Console my poor parents. Hearty thanks from a miserable sinner. Emma went out, rushing out to find a policeman. They searched through the night, and it wasn't until 3 weeks later that a bargeman saw the body of a lady floating in the Bannerman Canal, and she would be identified by Emma Innes as Maria Hall. Letters to her father, who was a pastor in Switzerland, were read out in court and showed that she felt she'd sinned unforgivably. Emma said she'd overstudied for her exam and was feeling disgraced that she then didn't sit it. But Goodman believes that Maria was, in fact, pregnant with George Harry Storrs' baby and had gone away to have the baby and then returned suffering with postnatal depression and the belief that having an illegitimate child out of wedlock with a married man made her unworthy and made her a terrible sinner. To me, that has more of a ring of truth to it than I didn't sit the exam and that has made me unworthy. But there is no proof for this. There was no post-mortem carried out, so we don't know whether Maria had been with child, and there is no evidence of this. This is just speculation. So did a relative of Maria Hall or someone who knew the situation come to avenge her situation and her death? What was it? Someone who was in love with her and who believed that she'd been taken advantage of? This would explain why George Harry didn't recognise his assailant. His family didn't recognise the assailant. It seems bizarre that someone would come all the way over from Switzerland, that it wasn't noted as having an accent of any kind. But it's a very interesting theory. It seems that perhaps in both cases, naming and shaming would have been less of a risk, whether it was to cover up a homosexual affair or to avenge Maria. Then it would seem easier to just say, look, I'm going to tell everyone what you did. Why did James Worrell kill himself? What was he in a homosexual relationship, which was illegal at the time in the UK and very frowned upon, but obviously incredibly actually normal, and therefore were these two men in a relationship that they wanted and needed to keep secret? I do think that the death of James Worrell is interesting, though perhaps he had just become so attached. But he had a wife, he had children, so that is very strange. The murder of George Harry Storrs remains unsolved. The case has intrigued historians and true crime enthusiasts for over a century due to its complexity and the dramatic circumstances surrounding the crime. The mystery has been the subject of various books and articles highlighting the perplexing nature of the case and the Victorian-era justice system's limitations. Obviously, now we would have loads of different kinds of forensics. We'd be able to see if there was blood on the window, if the blood belonged to a third party, not someone in the household. There'd be so much that we could do now. And it seems like we often, if you listen to true crime or you read about true crime, anything, even, that wonderful book, The Five, about the victims of Jack the Ripper, there's, a lot of talk about how these victims are overlooked because of who they are or who they're perceived to be. But George Harry Storrs was a big deal. He had money. He was a white, upper middle class man who employed a lot of people. The police went out and interviewed anyone seen to have been fighting or have blood on them or not been doing what they should be doing, or anyone known with a criminal record. And still, this case remains unsolved. And that is the story of the murder at Gorse Hall. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'd love to know what you think. If you're one of the people who emailed me and said, love to know what you think about this, I would want to know what you think. There is on the Patreon, there's like a forum on there. So if you feel like it, you can go over there. You don't have to be a member. You can just follow us without signing up if you don't want to sign up. I'd love it if you did sign up because you get loads of extra content. But you can go on there and you can start a chat. Everyone can share their ideas. Of course, on Spreaker, wherever you listen to your podcast, you can leave comments. But I want to know what you think because it is a strange one. So the book is called The Stabbing of George Harry Storrs by Jonathan Goodman. There's lots of articles about this and people have opinions on Reddit, and there's a lot to be seen. But yeah, it's one that you would think could be solved, but isn't. My God, I hope this is recorded properly. I hope to have sorted out my microphone woes by the next time I join you. But you can sign up to the Patreon if you want. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, The Monday Night Revue. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.